Now, the text chosen for the gospel passage certainly seems out of place for the first Sunday of Advent, as well as for the installation of a pastor. When we come to Advent, we may expect to hear, we may want to hear something about Mary, something about angels, something about shepherds, something about wise men, even though that's technically Epiphany. We may look forward to that. We may want to sing, "It's beginning to look a lot like Christmas," although certainly the weather today doesn't cooperate even with that. Or if we're focused on the installation of a pastor, we may want to think about what are the challenges that we're dealing with as a church in the 21st century. How do we share the gospel with a world that doesn't really seem to care? And yet, these texts, or the text from the gospel, talks about distress and confusion. Talks about people fainting from fear and foreboding about what is to come on the world. Although if we think about it, maybe that does reflect the challenges of being the church in the 21st century. But this passage, from the Gospel of Luke, when the gospel was being shaped, when it was being collected to be helpful to the life of the church, that immediate context was the fall of the temple in Jerusalem. It had been destroyed by the Romans. And even though the church had separated from the synagogue, even though the church, with its increasing number of Gentile members, was becoming distinct and different rather than simply being a branch of the Jewish faith, even though the church was being very different, this still rocked their world. This was like the world was being turned upside down. It was like the world as they knew it was coming to an end. And so the church found it helpful to remember and to preserve these words of Jesus that talk about the eschaton, the end of days, the end of the world as we know it. So the church holds on to these scriptures to give it hope, even when things seem to be falling apart. Periodically, people get frightened, and they think the world is coming to an end. We see that both inside the church as well as outside the church. Outside the church, we might remember the events of Jonestown, which happened, almost 50 years ago. Or we might think of the Heaven's Gate cult, where people committed suicide because they thought this comet Hale-Bopp was signifying the end of the world. Or we might think within the church, you might remember the book, The Late Great Planet Earth, written by Hal Lindsey back in the early 70s. Or more recently, the Left Behind series, I think 16 books published between 1995 and I think 2007. So periodically that seems to happen, that we get worried about the end of the world. Maybe we don't see that so much now. We're not worried about the end of the world. But certainly the world as we know it seems to be falling apart, shifting, changing in ways that may frighten us or at least make us uncomfortable. The recent release of the climate change report shows that our planet is in dire straits. Situation which becomes even more uncomforting or uncomfortable for us because there are some who don't believe that that's the case. And they don't think that we have to do anything to change the direction our planet is going. Or we might think of the growing opioid epidemic. The most recent issue of Money magazine speaks of how many millions, almost billions of dollars this crisis, the effect this crisis is having on our nation, and how it affects families, not only in terms of employment and a physical health, physical with an F, but it also has effects on our emotional health and spiritual health as well. Or as we look at the divisions in our country, the way that our nation seems to be so deeply divided, with the divisions seem to be growing wider and deeper. Sometimes some wonder if this American experiment in democracy is failing. And so, maybe the world isn't coming to an end, but maybe it's changing around us. It makes us uncomfortable. And when we give in to that discomfort, maybe all we want to do is sing "It's a Holly Jolly Christmas" and hope that all our days will be merry and bright. But instead of giving in to that kind of nostalgia, maybe we as a church need to pay close attention to the words of Jesus. Because in those words we find hope. In those words we find signs of life. For Jesus tells us, even though there may be distress and confusion and people fainting with fear and foreboding about what is coming on the world, nevertheless, our God is with us. Our God is with us. Our God has not abandoned us. We have not been left alone. We have not been left to our own devices. We have a God who is with us, who has come to be with us, who promises to come to us again. And we have a promise that the word of our God will stand forever. Even though things may change around us, the word of our God stands forever. So Jesus gives us a bigger picture of the world, that even though these things are changing, even though we might be afraid, our God is still in control. And our God stands with us. And in the midst of this confusion, in the midst of all these changes, we can see a bigger picture. And we are also told to stand up, to raise up our heads, to give witness to the truth that we know. We're not to hide, to hunker down, to try to stay safe within the four walls of our church buildings. But instead, we are to go out, to witness to the truth that we know, to witness to the love that we know. We are to witness to the world, and we are to be a witness to the world, that there are signs of life, that there are signs of hope in our midst. And truly, this congregation, the Church of the Covenant, is a sign of hope for our world. Because you demonstrate that the divisions that separated us back in the 16th century no longer have to keep us apart. You demonstrate that the divisions that we used to think were so important, don't really matter. But instead, we can come together. We can be a family. We can show that, yes, we may have different backgrounds, but we can honor and celebrate both of our families. We can honor and respect them. We can do things our own way. And we can witness to the world that Jesus Christ is Lord. You're doing that. We want to honor that. We want to recognize that. We want to celebrate that. And from one branch of your family, we want to lift up this day that you have found a good pastor. And we are glad that he is here. And we want to make this partnership that you have with your pastor official. So that's why we have come together this day, to witness, to celebrate, to recognize the good things that are going on here, and to remind us all that as we work together, we can witness to God's love. As we work together, we can be a sign of hope. As we work together, we can be a sign of life to a world that is full of distress, to a world that does not know what the future holds. But we can point to the future. We can point to the God who is with us now, the God who will come to us again. And in doing so, we can reflect the love that God has given us, and we can share that love with our neighbors and with our friends. Hallelujah.